So the score is Jamie 2, Wayne 2, Ronnie 1, Alan and Mohammed 0. Wayne just won 1, he's waiting for the winner of Jamie v Runner. First to 5. Crazy shot there by Jamie. Did he put one? No, he didn't.
I think we probably have quite a lot in common, and one of the things we have in common is an admiration for Bertrand Russell. Could you tell me about how you met him?
Originally, I heard about Bertrand Russell when he went to jail. He was protesting against the nuclear weapons, and he was arrested in 1961. When I read this in India, as a young man of 25, I said to myself, here is a man of 90 going to jail for peace in the world. What am I doing, young man, 25, sitting here drinking coffee? So I talked with my friend who was with me, and we said, let's do something to support Bertrand Russell. What can we do? Let's walk to Moscow, Paris, London, Washington, D.C. These four nuclear capitals.
Yes.
Yeah. And so we started to decide that, and we wrote to Bertrand Russell. And he said, I'm delighted that two young men want to walk all the way from India to America. But please walk fast so that I can see you when you come to England.
Because I'm 90.
Because I'm 90, that's right. So we started from the grave of Mahatma Gandhi. And we walked through Pakistan, Afghanistan, Iran, the former Soviet Union to Moscow, then Warsaw, Germany, Belgium, France, and then French people helped us to cross the channel, and we arrived in England. And we met Bertrand Russell, and he was so pleased. He said, I'm so glad that I'm still alive, and you walked fast enough for me. And then he helped us to cross the Atlantic, and so we arrived in America.
He gave you money to...
No, we said we don't want any money. We did entire journey from India to England without any money in our
So
pockets.
how did you live?
Just on hospitality of people.
How wonderful.
Everywhere people helped us, supported us, gave us hospitality, but not a penny. So we said to Bertrand Russell, we cannot take any money, because that is our vow, to walk as pilgrims, and so take no money. But we want to go to America, and we want to accomplish our destination. And so he said, I'll help you with the tickets. And so he helped us with 2 tickets in Queen Mary.
How wonderful.
Yeah. So we sailed across America in great luxury and arrived in New York, and then we walked to Washington, D.C.
Delightful story. He was a wonderful old man. I wish I'd met him.
Wonderful, wonderful. And when we met, we talked about everything, about China, India, Cuba, Wittgenstein, philosophy, everything.
Yeah.
So he was a wonderful man.
Yeah. Now, you're very keen on holism, I know.
Yeah.
Holism is a word that I associate with General Jan Smuts.
Yeah.
What does holism mean to you?
Holism means to me is that things are connected. Nothing stands in isolation. So when you look at a tree, you don't just look at a tree. You know the tree exists only because there is a soil. Tree exists only because there's a sunshine. Tree exists only because there is air. So many things make the tree. So just looking at the tree in isolation, without the context, without the holistic view of the surrounding, will be wrong, in my view. So holistic to me means seeing everything in their context, in their whole perspective, rather than in isolation.
That makes a lot of sense to me. But as a scientist who wants to actually understand how the tree works,
Yeah.
I would be more inclined to dissect the tree, to think about the molecules of water going up the transpiration stream inside the tree.
Yeah.
Think about the sun bearing down upon the leaves, which are kind of solar panels and are being used to catch carbon dioxide out of the air and so on. How do you reconcile those 2 views of the
There
tree?
is no contradiction.
Right.
As long as you have in the back of your mind the context of the whole, and within that whole you look at the parts, the detail. So I mean, for example, you're writing a book. Book is made of every sentence, every word, every syllable, every line, every page. But page is not the book. You have to see the book in the context. But you cannot see the book in the context without reading the page. You cannot read the page without reading the sentence. You cannot read the sentence without reading the words. So details are important, but they are only important within the context of the whole. So if people don't take the holistic perspective and only reduce the book to a page or to a title, then that I would say is wrong. But if the title is to understand the whole, then that reducing the science to its particulars will be useful. So in my view, there is no contradiction.
Right. I would think I'd put exactly the same thing, but I'd probably use the word hierarchy and say that there is a hierarchy of units within units within units.
Yeah.
And in order to understand something, at any given level, there's no point going too far down into the details.
Yeah.
So if you're, say, trying to understand how a computer works, for example,
Yeah.
you know that the computer actually consists of integrated circuits, transistors, and so on,
Yeah.
but it doesn't really help you. What you do is you think in terms of large units of software interacting with each other.
Yeah.
Whereas if you're an engineer who's trying to repair the computer,
Yeah.
well, if you're trying to repair the computer, you might well actually take out a whole integrated circuit board, in fact.
Yeah.
But finally, you would agree that you can reduce it down to ones and noughts, high voltage, low voltage states in a whole lot of integrated circuits.
Yeah.
So that there is explanation at all levels, but we have to think hierarchically.
I would not think hierarchically. I would think more in terms of network. So things are not higher or lower, but they are spread like a network. So when I say holistically, network is a good example for that, because one unit will not stand by itself. because it will fall down, it will break down. So in the same way, for example, if you take the tree, as I said in the example, tree is made of this network of elements which make the tree. If you take the sun away, the water away, the soil away, the gardener away, the forester away, there will be no tree. Tree is made of so many other elements which are not tree. So tree is made of non-tree elements. And that's why holistic view of the world is a kind of context within which particular detail, particular aspect you can understand better. Otherwise you are working. Why we have in the world today so much trouble? Because we forget the context. And we just take one issue and just tackle that single issue as if everything else is irrelevant. And this is why I think we have many more social crises, political crises. For example, in politics, we take just the terrorism as a separate element without seeing the context. Or we see poverty as a separate element without seeing the context. So without the context, text does not mean anything. Text needs context.
Okay. Yeah. I can see why one wants to say that the tree is an important part of the context of the tree. It's in the soil, it's in the air, there's in the sun, in a whole ecosystem, and very complicated ecosystem is. I'm not sure it's helpful to say that that's all part of the tree, however. I mean, that, to me, that's a slight misuse of language, because although the tree is sitting in a context, which is an ecological context and a soil context and so on, it's not actually part of the tree. You want to reserve the word tree for the wooden thing which has roots in the ground and has leaves at the top and is planted in the ground.
Yeah, but that's too simplistic. Just to reduce the tree to something what is roots in the ground and standing as a trunk and branches. Because we are, as a you scientist, and I as a philosopher, we want to go a bit deeper and a broader. We don't want to just be simplistic. We want to say there is no such thing as tree if you take all those elements away. because the roots and the branches and the trunk are made of other elements.
I think we're agreeing about everything that matters. I think that our disagreement is only semantic. I think that words need to be used in precise ways, and I fear that that's not
I
such
think
a
our
precise
difference is
use.
more than semantic.
Okay.
Our difference is quite basic, because what I'm saying is there is no such thing as a tree in itself. Tree is only tree when we see the whole context in it. And the moment you take the context away, there is no such thing as tree. Because we are stuck with tree, we lose the context, and therefore we can cut a tree thinking there's no problem. But when we are cutting the tree, if we remember the context, we will be very careful when to cut, when not to cut, how to deal with the tree. So the context, the holistic perspective is very fundamental. Whereas quite a lot of scientists, and I'm not saying yourself, but quite a lot of scientists go to a very particular reduced element, and they work only on their specialist aspect. And I think there science goes wrong.
Well, I think
As
we're
a philosopher,
probably, yes,
I believe.
I think we probably agree about that. And I mean, one was tempted to quote the sort of cliche about seeing the wood for the trees. I mean,
Yeah, exactly,
okay.
exactly.
Moving on to something else, I think spiritual is a word that you use a
Yeah.
lot. What does that mean to you?
What I mean by it is that world is made of two elements. One element is visible element, what we can sense, we can touch, we can taste, we can look, we can smell, we can feel. That's one. The other aspect of creation or existence or universe is invisible dimension, things we cannot see. So what is that element which is invisible? I call it spiritual. So like you say, there's a law. There is a law in letter and spirit. So letter you can see, you can read it, what is it? But interpretation, the spirit of the law, the meaning of the law differs according to the view of the reader or the lawyer or the solicitor. So world, in everything in the world, the whole entire universe has these two layers, the material layer, the spiritual layer. And they are not separate. They are absolutely integrated with each other. So matter cannot exist without the spirit. Spirit cannot exist without the matter. Without matter, spirit is useless. What is point of spirit? And without spirit, matter is dead. There is no life to it. So that living force, that quality, is what I call spiritual. So world is made of quantity and quality. Quality is spiritual, quantity is physical. Physical and metaphysical. These are the two elements which are married together. The moment we separate them, then some people become spiritualists in a little ghetto, other people become materialists in a ghetto, and they quarrel with each other. I say matter and spirit are two aspects of the same reality, two sides of the same coin.
But when you introduced that, you used the example of law, and you said there's the letter of the law and the spirit of the law.
Yeah.
And at that time, I understood that rather clearly. That
Yeah.
The spirit of the law is something about attitudes in human minds.
Exactly.
Human minds being in human brains.
Yeah.
But then you said you can't have matter without spirit, and there you lost me, because surely before there were human, or indeed brains of any sort,
Yeah.
around to think about things, there was matter, but there was no spirit.
No, but spirit is not necessarily just human spirit.
No, but before
But
there
there
were
is,
any
there is a
animals.
spirit in the room. When you go in a room, you say there is a good feeling here. There is a spirit of the room.
Well, now you've changed to something rather different.
The spirit is a very big and very holistic and very inclusive word. It is not defined in a one particular way. So when you go in a room, you can say the tree has a spirit. A rock has a spirit. It's a living rock for me. It's alive. The earth is alive. So the tree is alive. It's a human. The spirituality is not a monopoly of the human beings. Spirit
No.
is a very universal concept.
Did you try any of that on Bertrand Russell, if I may ask?
No, I didn't
No,
try
I don't
that.
think he would have liked that.
No,
that so much.
But I was only 26, 27 at that time, and I was talking to a man of 92,
Yes.
so I was a little bit humble.
Yes.
But now I'm 70, I can talk a little bit more forcefully.
See, what worries me about this is that you seem to me to be switching from one place to another, and it sounds as though you're using the same, indeed you are using the same words,
Yeah.
but they mean something very different. The spirit of law is one thing. A spirit when you go into a room is another thing.
Yeah.
The spirit in the tree
Is another thing.
is another thing, and probably, in my view, nothing. So don't you think you run the risk of being misunderstood by people who will think that you're talking about ghosts, for example, I mean, in trees?
No,
or...
I'm not talking about ghosts. I'm
but don't you
talking
run the risk of being
about
misunderstood?
the quality. I'm talking about the quality. Like human beings have body, senses, organs, all the things we have, which anybody can understand. But there is a quality of a human being, which is very unique to each and every human being. And now that is spirit. So quality cannot be measured. Quality cannot be analyzed. Quality cannot be defined. It's something you feel, you understand. Like your friendship. You cannot measure how much friendship I have or how much respect I have. You cannot measure it. But that's a kind of quality. And I call qualitative aspect of reality spiritual and quantitative aspect of reality material. That's all I'm saying.
Well, there are lots of things you might... Sorry. It's one thing to talk about a spirit of a human, and that humans are so complicated that that could mean all sorts of things. But you also said that rocks have a spirit, and that's, again, where you lose me. I fear that that's a misuse of words, because it's taking two very different things, a highly complicated thing like a human, or indeed a dog or a kangaroo, which has a complicated nervous system. But a rock, how can a rock have a spirit?
Rock has a spirit. Rock, you take a rock and give it to Henry Moore, and he will turn into a beautiful sculpture. Where does that sculpture come from?
From
The
Henry
quality.
Moore.
No, but Henry Moore could not make that quality by himself without the rock. Rock and Henry Moore are not too separate in that situation. They are like observer and the observed in relationship. So the rock has the spirit and Henry Moore has the spirit. And those two coming together, developing something, emerging something, unfolding something, and that spirit has unfolded. A lump of clay, you put it in the hands of Bernard Leach, and he turns into a beautiful pot. There's a spirit of the pot coming out of that clay. So let us not define the word spirit in a very narrow way. Let's understand the word spirit in a very broad way. And the broad meaning of the spirit is that what is the quality of the clay? What is the quality of the rock? What is the quality of a tree? What is the quality of a human being? What is the quality of a law? Anywhere there is a quality and there's a quantity. There's a physic, there's a metaphysic. Those two work together. If you separate them and you just bring spirit as a kind of human domain or a kind of some other domain, then you are reducing spirit to a very low level. But there's a universal spirit. The universe has a spirit. Oxford has a spirit. When you come to Oxford, you feel something different than if you were in London. So spirit is the quality of the place.
Well, I can appreciate that on a kind of poetic level, and I can sort of, at a poetic level, if I'm walking through Western Ireland or something, I can feel something you could call a spirit of it. But I think I want to use words more precisely and say that the character of a person, the thing that a person has, that Henry Moore has, for example, which he may then impose upon the rock with his chisel, is a different kind of thing from the spirit which a place has or a rock has. And I worry that you define things so broadly that you confuse by using the word in such widely different ways that it doesn't actually mean the same thing.
Yeah. It doesn't mean the same thing, but it still has a kind of, when you say human spirit, and other times you say spirit of the law, and other times you say universal spirit, of course it has a different meaning. So I'm not saying that it's the same meaning. When you say there's a friendship between husband and wife, and a friendship between a father and son, and friendship between two other unrelated individuals, there are different kind of relationships. Nevertheless, there's a friendship. So in the same way, I would use the spiritual quality of everything in a broad way. I'm not a scientist, I'm a philosopher, or to some extent I'm an environmentalist. I want to understand the quality of everything. And because we have become so materialistic and we are not having regard to the spiritual aspect of everything, we use the matter in a very disrespectful way. And therefore we are not even materialists because we don't use the matter with respect. If we consider the rock has spirit, tree has spirit, we will have a kind of respect for the rock, for the forest, for the rivers. We will not pollute them. We will not destroy them. We will not create global warming if we had a spiritual attitude towards the universe. We will have a kind of humility, ecological humility, because we have spiritual values. But when we see matter without spirit, and a spiritless matter, then use it as you like. It's just for the human use. What's the point in it? And therefore we destroy the forests, we destroy the oceans, we destroy the rivers, we destroy the land, we kill the animals, we become so cruel. So spirituality gives you a kind of humility. That's why I want to use the word spiritual in a very broad sense and not in a narrow sense.
Well, let's end as we began, with agreement. I want to agree with you very strongly. We do not want to pollute the world. We don't want to cut down the forests.
Yeah.
We don't want to cause global warming. We want to avoid all those things. Yeah. But my way of expressing why we don't want to do it is by looking into the future and saying this is what will happen if we do that. This will be a terrible, terrible disaster. And I can express that without saying that the rocks have a spirit and the trees have a spirit and the world has a spirit.
Yeah.
So we end up agreeing, though we use different language for doing so.
Yeah. Only problem what you are saying in that is problem with that approach is that we end up taking care of the earth and not polluting the oceans and cutting down the forest because of the fear of some kind, because we are afraid of global warming, or we are afraid of the end of human civilization or something like that. Whereas if you have a spiritual attitude towards the universe, then you take care of the earth, not because of the fear of the end of the world or end of civilization, but because of a kind of love and respect for the earth. So this is why I say that a kind of spiritual outlook, the word, I like the word. I think language is very important. And if we lose the word spiritual from our language, the language will become impoverished. Therefore, I don't want to lose the word spiritual from our English language.
I'm with you on the respect and on the love. I don't want to do it out of fear. I want to do it out of love and respect.
Yeah.
I worry about spiritual, though, because that suggests to me something supernatural, almost superstitious. Is there a danger that you'll be misunderstood to be talking about something supernatural, sort of magical?
I hope not, because supernatural is not same as spiritual.
Okay.
Supernatural or superstitious means that you are living in some kind of delusion, some kind of made up thing. Whereas when I say spiritual, I mean that we don't only look at the surface, on the superficial level, but we look at the level of the meaning. When you bring the meaning into your understanding and into your dialogue and your discourse, then it becomes bigger and a broader discourse. Whereas if you limit it to just the physical protection, then it is limited. But it is not supernatural, because everything is natural. Whatever is born and whatever will decay is natural. So we are natural. Human beings are nature too. Nature is not out there. The trees and the rivers and the mountains are nature, and human beings are not nature. We are nature too, because anything and everything which is born and which will decay and die is natural. So we are born and we will die, therefore we are natural. So there's nothing in supernatural or supranatural or superstitious in spiritual. Spiritual only looks at the quantitative and qualitative aspects of reality, and that's holistic.
But there are lots of people who would use the word spiritual to imply something non-physical, and so they would say that there's something in humans and perhaps in other animals which, say, survives their death, whereas a rock doesn't have that. And you seem to be, by uniting rocks with humans and other animals. Well, I mean, I would agree with you about insofar as both of them are natural and not supernatural.
Yeah, yeah.
But you seem to be using a word that almost everybody, I think, would take to be a supernatural word, a word like spiritual.
Yeah, I hope not, because I don't subscribe to something superstitious and supernatural. I subscribe to something because human beings have a kind of relationship between each other. In the same way, we need to have a relationship with the natural world. And what is that relationship? Relationship is based in some values. Relationship in itself is a value. Now, that relationship cannot be reduced to a material idea. So my emphasis is on the relationship and the quantity and quality aspect rather than just the material aspect.
But if it's not material, then what is it? I thought you just said that you only believe in the natural and not the supernatural.
Yeah.
If there's something which is not material, what is it?
The quality of material is spiritual.
Right.
Quality.
Yes.
Quality is not material. So supernatural does not mean that spiritual is not natural. Because nature has spirit. This is what I said. The trees have spirit, rocks have spirit. So it's not supernatural. Nature without spirit cannot exist. Like a tree cannot exist without the sunlight. It cannot exist without rain. It cannot exist without soil. Also, it cannot exist without the treeness. The treeness is the spiritual quality.
Or the rockness.
Or the rockness.
Yes.
Or the humanness.
Yes.
So that isness. The what is it? What is it? What it makes, what it is. The whole, that isness is not supernatural. It is part of natural. It is, without spirit there can be no nature.
Yes.
Natural spirit, nature spirit, you can call it.
I've always had a lot of trouble understanding that isness business.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
When you talk about the rockness or the quality of a rock, I can see as a scientist a rock has hardness and things like that, but I think that's not quite what you mean. It sounds as though what you do mean is something imposed by the human observer who somehow perceives or imposes this quality of rockness. It's not inherent in the rock.
No, it is inherent. There is an intrinsic quality in the rock. There is an intrinsic quality in the rock, and that intrinsic quality we can understand. Some may understand more fully than others, but it is not imposed. It is there, and only thing we can do is observe, and through our observation understand. So understanding quality of a rock is not imposition of the quality on the rock. It is just understanding. Like you want to know a person before you become a friend. You are not imposing your idea of quality on your friend. You know that person, you understand that person, and you appreciate that person. So in the same way, that intrinsic quality, the intrinsic spirit of rock has to be understood by us. And some of us may understand better than others. We cannot all be at the same level of understanding. In the same way as not all scientists are at the same level of understanding science. In the same way, not all religious people are at the same level of understanding religious principles. So in that way, different people may understand the spirit of the rock at a different level. But the spirit is intrinsic and innate and inherent in the rock.
And
it's
was
not
there
imposition.
in rocks before there was anybody to appreciate it?
Absolutely,
Okay.
absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah,
Right.
absolutely.
That means that there is something supernatural because a rock has no spirit.
We're not going to get anywhere.
No.
We-
I say to you that spirit is natural. Spirit is inherent and natural. You are standing there as a human being. You have intrinsic spiritual qualities of compassion, of friendship, of relationship. Huh?
I wouldn't call them spiritual.
They
That's
are
different.
spiritual. What would you call them? There are two words, material and spiritual.
Compassion, I would call them.
The
they're
in-
things
the-
that,
Yeah,
that
but
don't
that is invisible quality is spiritual, and visible quality is physical. That's how.
It's not invisible once I act on it. I mean, then it doesn't become. For me, doing is more important than any kind of thinking. If I'm compassionate to somebody, then it becomes visible.
Yeah, but only visible, only.
No.
Yeah, intellectually, maybe you can say this is compassion, but as a person, you are compassionate even when you are not expressing your compassion to anybody. Still, that intrinsic quality is there. It's not imposed by me on you. It's there. You have it.
I'd say
And
it's
when you act upon it, I understand it.
I mean, I can see that there are qualities in human beings that remain there, and even though they're not being acted upon, I can see that. That's different with a human being. With a rock or a tree, it hasn't got anything other than it hasn't. It's not conscious. It's not.
This is how our minds are conditioned to think that spirit is a human domain and human monopoly.
I don't
It is
believe
not.
so.
Let me have a go.
Yeah.
The rock, we know as scientists, has a crystalline structure,
Yeah.
and there are molecules,
Yeah.
atoms,
Yeah.
with a certain spacing in
Yeah.
the crystal, and we know about the energy in the nucleus of the atom and so
Yeah.
on. But to say that it's spiritual implies that there's something like, say, the spirit of a human when they're in love, or when they're angry, and it's misleading and confusing to use the word for a rock, which, unless you really think that rocks have feelings like being loving and angry and hurt and things like
No,
this.
no. The rock spirit is not the same as the human spirit.
But a rock is crystals. A rock is
But
atoms.
there is a rock quality in the rock.
Well, that's a matter of assertion. I mean, you are now simply asserting that.
Asserting, I'm understanding it. This is my understanding.
Okay.
This is my understanding. The rock has an intrinsic quality. And that intrinsic quality is irrespective of human interpretation or human understanding or human knowledge. Irrespective of it. Like a flower in the forest is beautiful. Even if nobody has gone to see it, nobody has ever photographed it, nobody has ever appreciated, yet that flower is there, beautiful. That beauty in itself is intrinsic quality of the flower. In the same way, the rock has its own intrinsic spirit, and that is there.
Well, I think we better just leave it at that.
Yeah,
and
yeah.
you had another.
I mean, to me, it gives it away because that beauty is always in the eye of the beholder.
No, it is not. It is not. It is not.
Okay.
Beauty is intrinsic.
No, it isn't.
It is. It is.
Come
It's
on,
not in the eyes of
can't just
beholder.
say, yes, it is. No, it is. Yes, it is. No, it
Sorry.
is.
Okay, I mean, I'm really interested to know. Because how do you know this?
Huh?
How do you know this?
How do you know it?
Yeah, tell Rich.
Yeah.
How do you know this?
That's what I meant when I said you keep asserting it. I mean, how do you know your assertion is right?
I don't know that my assertion is right. This is my understanding. This is my worldview. We have a worldview, and we shape the world according to that view. And we have to make a sense of the world. If we don't have a worldview, and if we don't make a sense of the world, then we cannot relate to the world. So how I relate to the world depends on me. What I say is that my assertion or my worldview that rock has spirit, flower has spirit, trees have spirit, that will give us a different kind of outlook towards nature. And that outlook will be more benign to the earth. If you have a spiritless, dead earth, dead rock, dead trees, they have no spirit, they are just matter, that will give you a different worldview, and that worldview will lead to a more destructive.
No, it won't.
That's my view. That's my
your view.
understanding.
Okay, it's
Yeah.
not mine.
This is what has happened.
I know it
in
is.
in the Western world, we have always believed that Earth is a dead.
I believe I'm as passionate as you in loving living things and
Yeah.
wanting to save them and stopping them going extinct and things like
Yeah.
that. It's not. I don't think they're dead. I mean, you said they were dead because they have no spirit. They're not dead. They're alive. They're alive in the sense that science understands them alive. I want to keep them alive, and if I want to save rocks, I mean, I want to save the Grand Canyon. I want to save mountains. I want to save rocks in that sense.
Yeah.
But I don't think that the reason I want to save them is because they have a spirit, but I think we can march together, we can walk together
Yeah.
to save the world,
Yeah.
although with perhaps different philosophies for the reason why.
Yeah.
Now, can I just raise one final question,
yeah.
which is the problem of humility and science. And I think you've written somewhere or said somewhere that science is insufficiently humble. Would you like to develop that?
Because science has seen the earth as a kind of separate object. And the moment you see a separate object, you manipulate the object to suit your purpose. So the history of science in last 100 to 200 years has been mostly manipulating the objects of natural world to suit the human needs. That I would consider as an arrogant view, an arrogant science. So I would like to see an ecological humility in which science says, my mind is always open, I've never closed my mind, I'm humble and I appreciate and respect natural world, and I'm searching, my mind is not closed. Quite often scientists say, this is it, this is the latest theory, until we don't know any theory, this is the final theory, this is where we have reached. The moment you close your mind, that's arrogance. The moment you keep your mind open and say, even there may be spirit, I'm searching for it, I'm looking for it, I'm trying to understand it. If I find a theory which proves that rock has spirit and trees have spirit, I'll accept it. That will be a humility. That will be an openness of the mind. The moment a scientist says, no, spirit does not exist, how do you know? We don't know. You have not yet found, you have not yet maybe understood, you have not yet maybe found a theory of the spirit. So until you find it, you believe what you are believing, but one day there may be a different theory. Before the theory of evolution, people did not know that there was evolution. That did not mean that evolution did not exist. Before the theory of gravity, people did not know that there was gravity. But that did not mean that gravity does not exist. In the same way, today, scientists don't know that there's a spirit in the rock, but that does not mean that in 10 or 20 or 50 or 200 years, there will be no new theory where scientists will come up with the idea that rocks are alive and have a spirit and have beauty and have intrinsic value.
I want to be open-minded, exactly. But I suspect that, and you're absolutely right, that there are going to be things that we will discover in the future that we couldn't possibly dream of today.
Exactly.
But I'm willing to bet you that the idea that rocks have a spirit is not going to be one of them. It'll be something much grander and bigger than that.
How can you bet that?
Well, I can bet it because I don't think we're using the word in a precise way. I think that it doesn't even mean anything to say a rock has a spirit, I suspect. And therefore, I'm not that interested in that. I am interested in agreeing with you that we have to be humble and open-minded to all the things that are going to come in the future that we don't yet understand.
But you are contradicting yourself. On the one hand, you say you want to be open, humble, but before that you said, but you expect it is not going to be ever spiritual. You have closed your mind.
Well, I meant...
You are contradicting
yourself. What
yourself.
I meant to say is that I don't think the word spirit is being used in a sufficiently precise way that we could ever know whether the proposition was true or not. But I do want to agree with you that we must be open-minded and humble and be aware that there's an enormous amount that we don't yet understand.
Fine.
And it will be grander and bigger than anything that we can yet imagine.
I'm delighted. I'm delighted to
Thank
hear
you very
that.
much
Thank
indeed.
you. Thank you. Okay. Thank you.
Well, that was a very engaging performance you gave us the other night, but I'm curious, what actually goes on in your head when you're getting these messages that you're relaying to people?
Difficult question to answer. It's not really a rational thinking process. I believe that I'm in touch with my unconscious mind, and that's, I believe it's a little bit like, my experience of it is a bit like the way ideas will come into a person's head. Like they'll come into a person's head almost like a fully formed idea, and we don't know where it's come from. And it's a little bit like that. I think you could call it your intuitive mind, I would think of it as.
But do you hear voices? I mean, do you sort of hear a male voice or a female voice, or?
It's a mixture of all the seeing, hearing, feeling, sensing. All of those things come together, but it's more like an blending of thoughts. It's as if my thoughts have been interlaid with another set of thoughts, and it's as if all I really need to do is look within myself. It's a form of introspection that I do, and it's from that I give the information I'm giving, and that seems to correspond with what the person understands about their person that passed over.
Sometimes you feel it's coming from this part of the hall or that part of the hall. So
yes, there's a
what's
sensation of
telling you
where it's
that?
coming from.
When you get a kind of glow from
It's
that part of
again,
the
see,
hall?
like that comes like a gut feeling. It's sort of like it's almost pulled from the stomach, is the feeling I would explain that as. I just feel I know I've got to go to that place, or I know I've got to go to that person. And you can't think, oh, I think I'll go over that side of the hall because I've been to that side first. You might find a whole cluster of people you tend to do all at once, which is, you know, just the way it goes. You're pulled to that direction, and that's how I feel it works.
Now, why do you think you're talking to dead spirits rather than, for example, picking up telepathic messages from the people who are in the audience, say?
Well, if you can accept telepathy, it could.
Well,
I don't. But telepathy, it could be telepathy. It could be argued that it could be telepathy. I would argue against that in that in some instances I've had instances where people have come to me afterwards and said that there's something. I, for example, said to one woman, there's a tin of green paint falling in your garage, and she went home and she found a garage was covered in green paint. Now, she didn't know that tin of paint had fallen, therefore I could not have read it from her mind, unless somehow my mind had been able to see remote viewing in another place. We could always argue with one way or the other how ESP works. But I think when you bring it all together, from my understanding, it is a connection with the spirit world rather than telepathy with the person.
do you have any trouble in the churchyard and picking up lots of...
Yeah, quite often drop in for a chat, eh? No, places like this, we believe that the spirit world is separate from the earthly world.
Okay.
I mean, you get lots of silly programs that talk about ghost hunting and things like that. Maybe there's vibrations, maybe there's these things called residual energy they talk about. But I believe in the spirit world that we go to after death. All I argue is that the personality continues after death. I don't even know if there's a God. But I can argue that there's what I try to prove through my work, that life continues, that our personality somehow survives.
Do you find a churchyard rather a crowded place? Have you got the bandwidth to cope with it?
Yeah, a good place to drop in for a chat, I
Yeah.
suppose. But no, I think the churchyard, actually, you might feel the residual energy psychics talk about of people that have been here before, i.e. the people that have grieved here before and so forth. But I believe that what happens is the spirit goes into what we call the spirit world after death. And that world is a world that I hope I can prove through my mediumship, and is something that is, I believe we prove fundamentally the continuation of the personality after death. I don't even prove there's a spirit world, I don't even prove there's a God. But what I tend to do, I believe, is suggestive of life after death.
I think if I were talking to someone in the spirit world, I wouldn't waste time talking about tins of green paint. I'd say things like, what's it like being dead? What's God like? You know, things. I mean, can you see the whole of the universe? Can you see what everybody's doing? Why do you ask them such banal questions?
Yeah, good point. But I think what happens is that it's the way the mediumship works. Mediumship comes, I believe, from the non-rational, non-verbal parts of the brain, if there's such a thing. I believe it's like a holistic understanding. It's a blending of thoughts between myself and the spirit communicator. So often the things that will come to us may be things that I can grasp. It's not like a telephone call to them and able to give this. Sometimes we get what we call clairaudience, where it gives me the feeling of like hearing. But most of the time it's what we call a clairsentience, a sensing of the personality, the feelings, the sensations. And sometimes the smallest things can be very important. For example, my wife said recently to a sitter, I wanted to give you a tin of Bovril, not Bovril, Brasso, the cleaning fluid. And the woman had given that as the key word that she was going to be the key word to say that when I survive, I'm going to show you a tin of Brasso. They'd already pre-agreed that. So sometimes little things could be hugely significant. But if only it could be just like a telephone line. Us mediums are working through a very difficult form of communication, which is not like the normal earthly communication.
So that's why the spirits don't tell you things clearly, but you get these kind of vague word that sounds a bit like the word that the person's looking for, something like... I mean, I was struck, for example, that you said something like Simon Bennett, and there was a girl who said, oh, well, my boyfriend was called Ben, and he had a friend called Simon. And I sort of wondering, why don't the spirits kind of talk to you more clearly than that? Why do they use this obscure roundabout, almost like solving a crossword clue?
Yeah, I think you could argue that that people try to make things fit sometimes, and sometimes people do that. But I believe that sometimes what we're getting is we're getting the kind of the whole picture. It's a bit like when you're dreaming. When you're asleep and you dream, you've got a mental process going on, but it's completely different to the sort of mental process we use in waking life. And it's very similar with mediumship. We're getting the information almost all at once sometimes. It's a thought communication as opposed to a verbal communication. So words can be particularly difficult, names can be particularly difficult sometimes, because that's all out of the rational mind. I think this was probably here. Perhaps in times before we developed language. Maybe it would have made environmental sense for us to be able to communicate by telepathy when we couldn't use words. It would have made some form of sense if we had a gut feeling that the waterhole was poisoned, or that we were being stared at by dangerous animals. I mean, these things perhaps were there before language developed.
Well, in your performance the other night, you got a few hits in amongst the misses. Isn't what you're doing cold reading?
Well, depends what you call cold reading. This is something that a lot of the rationalists have come up with, is saying that what you do is you say something and people basically make it fit. And I think there sometimes can be cases where people do make things fit, and they do try to sort of use convoluting thinking to try to pull disparate things together again. But I think when you really examine the evidence of what myself and other mediums do, you will find that a large proportion could never be explained away by something like cold reading. It's because there are sometimes such specific details that come through that there's absolutely no way that anybody else in that audience could ever take in that fact as their own, but only the person that was the recipient of that message.
One of the things about specific information like that, which I agree with you is impressive, is that only the stories which are specific are the ones that get repeated. I mean, you told us the green paint story just now. You don't go around telling stories where what you said, what you predicted, didn't happen. So there's a kind of one-way filter whereby only the impressive stories, the green paint stories, get repeated, and no doubt many viewers of this program will go away and tell other people about the green paint story. But you don't say, do you know, I went to a medium and he said that there would be green paint in my garage, and I went home and you know there wasn't. That people don't repeat those stories.
It's true. You're talking about selective memory, aren't you, here?
Selective memory and selective
remember
repeating.
the things they want to remember.
Yes.
And I'm sure that would be the case for anything. I mean, I expect it's happened in science as well, I should think, where people have seen what they want to see. But I think if you do examine the body of evidence carefully, you will find that there is a large bulk of what is said is accepted by the person. I don't claim to be 100%. I think that would be arrogant to say that. I think I get a lot wrong, and I think other mediums do get a lot wrong as well, because it's such a difficult form of communication. But I believe that within it, there is a large body of evidence that would be suggestive of life after death. And within that too, there are sometimes things that are so very specific that you've got to think about it. Something that will stand out, that is, you know, so absolutely specific to that person, it certainly should be worthy of investigation by science, I feel.
Well, science is always ready to investigate things. The thing about science is that it investigates the whole picture. It investigates all the misses as well as the hisses, as well as the hits. It counts the misses as well as the hits. And there is a real risk that only the hits get published or get repeated. It does happen in science. I mean, there's a risk in science that I think it's called the desk drawer effect, whereby studies that apparently don't show an effect don't get published. They get stuck in the desk drawer, and only the ones that apparently do show an effect end up getting published. So there is a danger of a kind of one-way filter, which we have to be very careful of.
And it also can be people like myself, people that are into all the mystical things, have beliefs. But so do scientists have beliefs. And the problem is, I think if you come to this subject with a pre-made agenda to say it's all a load of nonsense, therefore, and then you start looking at it purely from the point of view, that's rubbish, that's rubbish, that's rubbish. When you start, these things are dealing often with human testimony. Just as it's more like a court of law in some respects, because human testimony in a court of law will have a person perhaps hung. But in terms of trying to prove ESP or trying to prove the paranormal, that human testimony is analysed to the point that it becomes almost irrelevant. For example, often they'll say, oh, that medium asked 20 questions when he was given the reading, but the questions will often be sort of, your father in the spirit world is named George, is that correct? Yes. He was a big man, is that correct? Yes. So often things like that can get twisted and distorted. And I think the body of evidence really has to be looked at in such a way that we have to take into the fact that we're not dealing in the same way as we are with hard science. We're dealing with people, with people's understanding of this, with people's... if you've convinced a person that that's their grandmother to the point that they're actually crying, I mean, surely those tears enough are perhaps proof that they've had proof that that really is their grandmother that's making the communication.
I think it could indicate just desperate wishful thinking, perhaps. I mean, one of the things I noticed looking around the other night at your séance was that people did seem to be very, very anxious. They were on your side. I mean, they were really trying to help, and they didn't look terribly convinced.
I told them off. I didn't think
I
they
know,
were
I know
very
you did.
much,
I know you
to be
did.
honest.
But time and again, you would say, and I thought, well, that's a hit, isn't it? But yet they looked sort of unconvinced. They didn't really look very persuaded by it, and then it was as though they were desperately searching around for a way in which they should make it a hit. For example, you got a Morris Minor the other night, and you said a black Morris Minor, and I went and asked the man afterwards, was it really a black Morris Minor? And he said, well, no, it wasn't black, but it was very dirty, so it looked black. And I mean, that's a very typical example of where they're desperately trying to embrace within the envelope of what you've said something that actually wasn't in it. So you've got them on your side, and again, the girl whose boyfriend was called Ben, and so it wasn't Simon Ben. It was a boy called Ben who had a friend called Simon. You sort of feel if you start allowing, and actually you were rather good at picking up on those cases where the audience might have thought it was a hit, but you, as it were, discounted it. I was rather
I think it's
impressed
important
with
that you
that.
try to discourage people from making things fit, because that, I agree, that would discredit any good evidence that I was likely to give. I would rather get a lot wrong and one thing absolutely right, rather than people try to just be helpful or try to make things fit in. And people do have a tendency to do that, I do agree with you. But it does not undermine the fundamental fact that in good mediumship, facts can come through that can, I believe, give absolute proof that the personality continues after death.
Do you see your role as essentially pastoral? I mean, are you trying to help people?
No, not really, not pastoral in that sense, because I'm not a great lover of religion in many ways, even though I tend to do this within spiritualism. I find that is my outlet to do the work. I feel that, in a way, it's just my duty, because if I do have this gift and I can prove that life continues, I'm almost a bit reluctant as a medium. I came from a completely different background. I came from a background of working in advertising agencies and all sorts of things, and was quite sceptical about the whole idea before it was proven to me first. And I feel that really, I don't think it's pastoral. I believe I'm helping people, and therefore I believe it's a wonderful gift, and I believe it must be used, and I feel it's my duty.
Do you feel it might actually be damaging to some people, but as it were, stopping them from letting go after they've lost somebody that they love very much?
It's a good point, but a lot of people bring up that, but I believe that it does help people to progress and move forward. I mean, because I believe what I do is absolutely true. I believe that I give
You
people,
really believe it?
I believe absolutely
Seriously,
100%
you believe it?
that it's true, because it's been proven to me against what I believe is against my rationality. I believe it to be true. I would prefer in some ways to come onto your side and be rational and say it's all a load of nonsense, because it makes it easier to argue. But it's been shown to me so many times that life continues, and personal proof that I've had that has given me proof of my father pass of continuation of spirit, and my sister's proof that she had just after her husband died. I mean, incredible things that are so very personal and subjective, they're hard to argue a case for. But for me, it's been life transforming, and I believe as I was helped, I can help others.
Have you seen any of the performances given by skeptics who are educated in cold reading, expert in cold reading, actually showing what one can do with cold reading? I mean, they're very impressive. They amount essentially to conjuring tricks.
Yes, I know. I've seen these, and I can see how they're cleverly worded, that it can be taken either way. It can be, this person's a sceptical person that's also got a very open mind, you know, type of thing, and astrology that's been made to fit. And so, yes, there is a case for that. But I don't think that should overshadow the fact that true mediumship can actually give the sort of evidence that should certainly make the skeptic think.
But if you go to a really good conjurer, say a mentalist, and the conjurer's act is to read thoughts, and they call it reading thoughts, and of course you and I know that it's just tricks. And they're 100% right. They get it right every single time. If they had as many misses as you were getting, or as any spiritualist gets, they'd be booed off the stage.
It'd probably be a bit more believable too, actually, because I think often it's the fact that sometimes mediums get it wrong, actually, that kind of proves that they're not trying to make games up.
Well, I mean, I think that's probably right, but
You know.
there's a sort of double standard where a conjurer has to sort of, actually show that he's got nothing up his
Yeah.
sleeve and there are no wires under the table and so on. But somebody like you can get away with what? I mean, I don't know what sort of hit rate you get, about 10% hits or something in a typical evening.
I hope it was a lot more than that. But,
Well, and yet you don't have to go through the rigours of proving that you're not that you're not cheating.
Well, we do go through the rigours. Well, certainly within spiritualism, anybody working within spiritualism is carefully scrutinised. Anybody couldn't just stand up and work within a spiritualist church. They are carefully scrutinised before they work. There are mediums out there that I would worry very much about, indeed. But I think and also within spiritualism, I mean, we're all doing it for free. We're all giving our time for free. We're giving it costs you money to get to a spiritualist church, and you only take a minimum sort of fee for your transport. I mean, it would seem a bit of a pointless exercise. I can't see the reason for doing that.
Well, that's the most impressive thing you've said to me this afternoon, but that, of course, is not true of many in America who make big money out of doing this kind of
thing. Well, people can, but then also people, I don't, there's a case to argue also that people should, doctors shouldn't earn money because they're saving people's lives and so forth. I mean, once you accept it's a true thing, you see, from a skeptic's point of view, to say, these guys are out and they're ripping people off on a very bereaved point in their life, if you believe it's all untrue, then yes, I would understand, you would think it was an awful, awful thing. But if you do sincerely believe and know it to be true from your own personal experience, then you can look at it in a different way, because then you can see that they're helping people to pick up the pieces again and move forward, and life for them becomes whole again. There's a lot to be said for the rationalist arguments. And I think the rationalists need to look at it as well. There's no reason they shouldn't, because people tend to believe too many things before breakfast, like in Alice in Wonderland. But at the same time, there is a core of truth to it that I believe needs investigating properly. And that it's not just psychology with people making it fit. It's not mediums trying to trick people into believing things that they shouldn't. There is a truth behind it. And even though it goes against what we would, all our rational thoughts, there is another aspect of it to the world, I believe, that we can prove through mediumship.
I believe that you're sincere. I'm absolutely sure that many of them are not. But thank you for being sincere yourself.
Thank you.
How do you know that it's not telepathy? How do you know it's the spirits talking, not people in the audience communicating directly to you?
Well, something telepathic has to be already in that person's mind. So if there's something I can say to the person that they don't know anything about, for example, there was an instance where I said to someone that there was a tin of green paint falling in your garage, and when they went home that day they found a tin of green paint had actually fallen and there was green paint all over the garage. They didn't have that in their mind, so it was obviously coming from another source, which would have been, I believe, the spirit world. If not the spirit world, perhaps some form of remote viewing. But either way, they're unusual. They're certainly would disprove, I think, telepathy itself.
So do you think the spirits can actually see everything in the world? Tins of green paint everywhere, cars driving down the road, power stations?
Yeah, I believe they're aware of this world, definitely. How much they can project onto the medium's mind. I mean, if I was a brilliant medium, I might be able to tell you, the number on a random number generator. But the whole thing is with mediumship is it works through that, what I believe is the intuitive side of the mind, the non-verbal side of the mind. So often the information that we're able to pick up has to come through our intuitive sensing side as opposed to our logical mind.
My being impressed at some of your hits was slightly lessened after the meeting, when I went around and talked to some of the people and learned that many of them keep coming back to the same thing again and again. They know each other and they know you, and you've read some of them sometimes 3 times before, which suggests that you could have been using the same information that you got from them out of on a previous occasion. I mean, that's one problem with this sort of coming back. The other problem is it suggests they might be a bit addicted to this kind of thing.
Okay, there's 2 questions
Yeah.
there, and people do obviously come back to spiritualism often, and although I was not conscious of going to people that I'd been to before, I have been serving Camberley Spiritualist Church for some years, so there's probably a likelihood that I could have perhaps unconsciously remembered stuff possibly, but I do know that the information that is given in such a way that it's fresh to me. I don't know who I'm going to. As for people coming back time and time again, well, if the best readings are usually when a person has had such proof that they never need to see a medium again. That would be the most successful of a mediumistic sitting in my mind. That's usually done within the private sitting. But people also get a lot of solace and I suppose reinforcement by coming back and sharing with others spiritualist service. That sharing is part of the healing process, because bereavement is an awful thing to get over, and it's something that people don't get over just because they've been given the proof there and then. It takes time, and I think a lot of empathy comes between people sharing their experiences and helping one another to make those contacts with the spirit world.
But going back to the first question about the fact that you may have met these people before and therefore have previous access to the information, there would be plenty of people who would have been impressed by some of the hits that you got without realizing that actually you knew that, but whether consciously or not, you knew that because of previous encounters. So it does rather lessen the strength of the evidence that you keep talking about.
Yeah, I think in that particular case, I would have said it would weaken the evidence there. I would agree with you, because it's much better if you've come to somebody you've never ever encountered before, and in fact I didn't realise I'd been to that person before. In fact I was a bit shocked when she said, you know.
Yeah.
But nonetheless, I think again with these things, I think it's it's like with any scientific experiment. It's a number of proposals that are gradually build the evidence up to say everything's correct or not. And I think with mediumship it's the same. One needs to investigate quite a lot of it and quite a lot of mediums to find out where the proofs are or not. But I believe that the general bulk that has come through spiritualism certainly has convinced many a person and many a great mind, including, for example, the fellow that helped Darwin, Alfred Russel Wallace, who was, you know, I mean, he put the whole theory of evolution with Darwin originally. They presented it together, and Wallace even sent his papers to Darwin, didn't he?
Yes, he did.
So you'd have been defending a spiritualist if things had been slightly different in history.
Yeah. Yes, Wallace went decidedly odd in his old age, there's no doubt about it.
Newton went odd in his old age too, and so did Einstein. You know, it seems strange, doesn't it?
One of the hits you got was Mrs. Watson, and who was a local school teacher. Not Watson, Jenkins.
I don't remember.
Jenkins. Mrs. Jenkins. Who was,
start that again.
Yeah. One of the hits you got was a local school teacher called Mrs. Jenkins, and it afterwards turned out that she was well known. I mean, she taught at the school. You know, maybe half the people there had either been taught by her or had children taught by her. So there would be at least some mediums who might have done a little bit of local research, looked up in the local paper or something, and found a name like Mrs. Jenkins that everybody would have known. Do you accept that some mediums might do something like that?
I think it's pretty unlikely, to be honest, because I mean, I certainly wouldn't know that. I come from Southampton. Camberley's quite a distance from Southampton. It would have been awful to have ever researched things like that. I don't think the general medium would research things like that. I do worry sometimes about TV shows when people are asked to sign who they want to get in touch with before they see the medium. Yeah. That worries me.
Yes.
So I certainly do think that we do need safeguards, and particularly TV mediumship. I think there should be much more safeguards than there are, instead of just presenting it as entertainment and then that's it. But I do believe that us mediums are generally very, very rare to find anybody that would deliberately try to cheat.
I'm sure you don't, or you'd have actually got more hits than you did. But nevertheless, there are some mediums who, for example, have stooges who go around the audience beforehand, I don't know, in the sort of coffee beforehand, and get some information and then feed it to the medium. Are you aware that that goes on with some of your colleagues?
Well, I think if it was to happen in spiritualism, it would seem a pretty lame thing to do, really.
Of course it's a lame thing to do, yeah.
Well, because there's no reason I could see them possibly wanting to do it. There's no financial reward. I suppose you could say there's an egotistical award, but that would seem to...
Well, there's certainly a financial reward in America, and I mean, one famous American medium did that, and he had a little earpiece, and it was actually, he was having information fed to him by stooges in the audience. And James Randi, the famous skeptic, had actually got an engineer to intercept the radio frequency. And so you could actually hear the messages being fed to the medium. And so the medium was saying, I'm getting somebody called Albert, who is Albert? And just before that, you heard on the radio signal the stooge saying, ask him about Albert.
Well, if anybody has done that, I think they should be drummed out of mediumship and spirit.
But this man is doing very well.
Spiritualists would also be the first to condemn. They have in the past thrown out mediums and exposed mediums that have cheated and they might have gone on to television sometimes later. But within spiritualism, you will find the safeguards are in place, and certainly that type of thing would never happen within the confines of spirit, which is the best place where people really want to investigate this could start looking for the sincere mediums.
You said that scientists also can be subject to delusion and to gut feelings which can be wrong, and that's true, which is one of the reasons why the scientific method has put into place a whole lot of techniques for specifically eliminating the possibility of that bias. So a scientist, for example, may deliberately deprive himself of the information when he's comparing, say, an experimental with a control in any kind of experiment. He doesn't allow himself to know which is the experimental and which is the control. Not because he thinks he's actually dishonest, he's probably not dishonest, but because with the best will in the world, it's very difficult not to be biased when you know what you're doing. So when you defended spiritualism by saying that it's a human thing, it's not subject to scientific investigation, in a way that's selling the past, because what a scientist wants to know is, can you eliminate the human human element and actually demonstrate in some kind of a foolproof way that it really is not cheating and that it really is a genuine effect.
And what you've said, you more or less thrown out the whole of psychology, really, because
No.
psychology works like this. I mean,
No,
nowadays
it's not
people
true.
might say, well, Freud is probably completely wrong.
Well,
and
they
was an
would say
early
about
sort
that
of
about
an
Freud,
idea,
but not about experimental psychology, not about psychology which actually does experiments and tests, and very, very rigorous tests. For example, telepathy experiments are very, very rigorously controlled.
Well, there's been
and
some interesting
statistically
experiments with telepathy experiments, particularly experiments where people have been stared at, particularly some of the experiments using video imagery as opposed to the Zener cards, which is like static cards that people look at. And certainly I believe that the bulk of these paranormal researchers are often shunned by normal sort of mainstream science, as if there's something that we're worried about. As if it's threatening the very fundamentals of science.
It's not that. I mean, if I could demonstrate telepathy, I would be absolutely delighted, because I would be demonstrating a completely new force of physics that nobody had ever discovered before. If I could demonstrate telepathy really, really conclusively under controlled conditions, I would get the Nobel Prize for physics. And that's not
how Einstein got his Nobel Prize, by trying to disprove quantum theory. So maybe it would take someone like yourself to ultimately trying to disprove it may actually eventually prove it. In fact, I think actually the proofs will finally probably not come through psychology, it will probably come through something like quantum physics, because we don't even understand what awareness is, what consciousness is yet. And what I'm talking about is that we're involved in the world's introspection of human sense of being, of the feeling and sense of becoming in life. All those things are so hard for science to ever be able to apply the current rules we have of science to, that I think what I'm doing is kind of in amongst that area. It's in the area which is very hard to prove with the normal dissecting tools of science. It's about the human condition and the continuation of the human condition after death.
Scientists, in a way, protect themselves from the accusation of being deluded or self-deluded by doing their experiments under rigorously controlled conditions. So it's not that people actually believe that scientists are necessarily deluded, but they like to be assured that the conditions of the experiment are such that it can't happen. I mean, would you submit to some such rigorously controlled experiment?
I think there could be some very interesting ones that could take place. For example, I'd be very interested to know what happens if one's doing this type of work, and what happens inside the brain. We can measure inside the brain with PET scans and things like that nowadays. Is something happening inside my mind that's different to a normal person's mind? Has something changed in me when I claim to be in communication with another personality?
We're back live from Wales, but it's been an extraordinary spring all over the UK.
We'll be finding out how our wildlife is coping with this, the coldest spring in 30 years.
We'll be watching real live dramas as they unfurl on the live cameras. This whole place is wired. Let us go now to our first live camera and see a sodden buzzard. It hasn't stopped raining.
A sodden buzzard. What a way to start Spring Watch.